Thank you all for joining us on this Friday evening, early evening, with the NSU Symposium. We're coming to the final sessions, and it has been wonderful. Thank you so much to all our sponsors and supporters of the NSU Annual American Indian Symposium. And it's not long till we'll be reaching the 50th year. So we're really excited for that and hope that you all stay in touch, come back. We'll be doing this again next year. Who knows, hopefully in person or some connections there. Fingers crossed. So thank you all for joining us. And I'm chiming in now from Jollagee country in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, headquarters and homelands of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and the Anayakatua Band of Cherokees. I am a guest here, but an assistant professor of history and an affiliate of Cherokee and Indigenous Studies. My name is Dr. Farina King, and I'm serving as the moderator for the session today. But I am a Diné, a citizen of Navajo Nation. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this, this session on the presentation, A Southern People, Cultural Change and Identity Formation in the Choctaw Nation, 1800 to 1861, with Josh Phillips, who is a PhD student at Southern Methodist University. He is studying the alliance between the Choctaw Nation and the Confederacy in the Civil War. So absolutely fascinating histories here, and kudos to you and friends at SMU. I was a fellow there at the Clement Center. So it's great and an honor to have you and folks from SMU chiming in too. So Josh, without much further ado, I'll turn the time over to you because we do try to stay within 50 minutes. So hopefully we can have at least 10 minutes of that 50 minutes for Q&A or open to some exchange with our attendees here today. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you for that introduction. I'll do my best to move through this information. Just a little bit of background first. This is part of just perhaps a chapter of what will be my dissertation that I'm working on now. This project came out of a seminar at SMU on Native American history that was very open-ended and allowed me to choose any group that I thought would be interesting and any time period that I thought would be interesting. And I'd always wondered about the Native Americans who had allied with the Confederacy during the Civil War and wanted to understand their motivations and some of the reasoning for that alliance. And so this project was born, and this chapter in particular focuses on the changes in culture, a little bit of politics as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about government, but generally cultural change and how the Choctaws, while remaining Choctaw, became closer and closer to their white Southern neighbors culturally, and how that led to political and military alliance in the Civil War. So the first individual that I want to draw attention to, since we're talking about visionaries of Indian country in this symposium, is Colonel David Folsom, who was a chief of the Choctaw Nation in the late 1820s and up through removal, because he forms a sort of template or is a very important founder of a lot of the changes that occurred in the Choctaw Nation that led them towards these deeper relationships with Southerners and towards this alliance with the Confederacy. So I'm actually going to just draw attention to what's really the beginning of my paper through the thesis statement that talks about why I chose David Folsom and how he provides this template for what we're going to be looking at in this presentation. The text that you're seeing on the screen now is the epitaph of David Folsom. This is written on his tombstone at Fort Towson, and it describes this sort of ferment of change that he was living through and that he participated in and guided. It says that he was the first Republican chief of the Choctaw Nation the promoter of industry, education, religion, and morality. So these are the things that he wanted to be remembered for, the things that he thought were important about his life and his leadership of his people, both during the time that he was chief and afterwards. And so I think through that we can see some areas in which the Choctaw Nation went through tremendous change in the first half of the 19th century under the guidance of leaders like David Folsom. Folsom and those who followed him, such as Tandy Walker and Robert Jones and others that we'll talk about, consciously and actively fostered changes in government, in religion, in the economy, and in social relationships with whites that made some significant alterations to Choctaw culture that acculturated them further towards their white Southern neighbors, with the goal ultimately of always retaining Choctaw political sovereignty, which was always paramount to these leaders. But the key really for me, what I noticed in doing this research and what became a key component of my dissertation was I noticed that these changes were not just adaptations to a broad generic American society, because we often just think, especially today, when we have more of a mass culture that has really spread across the country and regionalism has become less important, we tend to think of just Americans or of American culture. But antebellum America was, of course, much more regionally divided by culture. And so the Choctaws did not adapt so much to some sort of broad, amorphous, generic American culture and society, but rather to a particularly Southern one. And these changes generally had popular approval. We'll talk about some of the disagreements along the way. But were generally met with the approval of the Choctaw people, who by the time of the Civil War came to identify themselves as a Southern people and to cast their lot with the Confederate States of America, for which they made tremendous sacrifices in hope of retaining their sovereignty and culture. And so let's take a look at how that happened. How did the Choctaws come to identify strongly with their Southern neighbors to the extent that they were willing to risk lives and property in a conflict alongside them? So here are some of just the general areas of change that we're going to look at. What Choctaw culture, government, et cetera, was like through the 18th century, and then what it was like on the eve of the Civil War. We see through the 18th century a more traditional tribal form of government with certain conceptions of what leadership should be like, which slowly morphs into a more Republican form of government and different conceptions of citizenship and what the leader of a government should be like. We see some shifts from the earlier, more reciprocal subsistence-based economy with trade in areas like the deerskin trade to the greater importance of the market economy and livestock raising and cotton culture, which reflected what was going on in neighboring states. We see some shifts from the native religion of the Choctaws towards a stronger influence of Christianity, especially on the leaders of the Choctaw Nation and its government and the role that Christianity had in government. And we go from a more limited and distant contact with whites. You have some traders coming in, some families forming through those relationships. But in the generations to come, the offspring of those relationships become very influential leaders, social elites, and not just within the tribe, but we also see tribal members, whether they're full blood or mixed race, having very close contact with white Southerners from Texas, from Arkansas, who they shared trade relationships with, or they shared social organizations with. And so we'll talk about that a little too. And we also see a shift from more of an ethnic identity towards more of a Choctaw national identity, sort of overcoming some of those divisions and coming together to have a nation formed on the idea of citizenship as a Choctaw citizen, and also as part of the mosaic of Southern society, Southern culture. So the first area that I want to focus on is government, because it's an area in which we see tremendous change during this time, and change that aligns Choctaw government more closely with the governments of the neighboring states of Texas and Arkansas. In the beginning of this time period, in the 18th century, you have 3 autonomous divisions within Choctaw government. And this was helpful during that time when Spain and France and England were strong, because these divisions were able to play off the European powers, one making perhaps an alliance with another, a different division with a different European power, and they could kind of work the European powers in that way. But in the middle of that century, they end up getting pulled into a very brutal civil war that was very devastating to the Choctaw people. And so along with that, you have the rise of the United States as being kind of the hegemonic power in North America. And so the Choctaws come to realize that they can't be divided as a people, whether that's, along ethnic lines or with a divided government, and present a united front to this hegemonic power that they're now having to face. And so you see more efforts towards unity. You also see a shift in leadership. The conception of a leader begins to shift across the early 19th century. Previously, Choctaw chiefs had really gotten a lot of their prestige from spiritual power, from things like guiding a successful hunt or raid, bringing back prestige goods from far away to show to people back home as a symbol of their spiritual power. But in the early 19th century, that begins to shift more towards establishing relationships with Europeans or with the United States that can bring back material goods that will be useful to people, so that those can be redistributed by the chief to people within the nation. And so you begin to see a shift from a more of a spiritual sense of leadership power to a more material one. And so there were important chiefs like Fanchamistabe in the late 18th century who fostered those changes. And most of these were agreed upon because they brought tremendous benefits. And so he's kind of a precursor to David Folsom in that he's slowly guiding these changes that will lead towards closer relationships with white Southerners and a closer embrace of that culture. But of course, nothing like this is ever unanimous. And even when there's areas of agreement, there's usually areas of difference. And so the historian James Taylor Carson made a good distinction in calling one group of leaders within this time period the primordialists and the others the cosmopolitans. Now, he says that both of these groups agreed on embracing the market economy and on bringing in missionaries to set up schools for the education of their children. But he notes that they disagreed on the political autonomy of those old divisions. The primordialists were concerned about consolidating power under a single chieftain or of uniting the divisions all together into one centralized entity. And as a part of that, they wanted to kind of keep alive the old ethnic identities and the religious practices that supported those, especially around funerary rites and some things that we'll talk about soon. Whereas the cosmopolitans felt like they needed to consolidate those divisions in order to present a more united front towards the United States, that they needed to, as a part of that, kind of move beyond those ethnic identities and practices towards a Choctaw national citizenship, and that they should look into embracing Christianity as a way to demonstrate to the United States that they were, in the eyes of Americans, considered progressive, right? Considered to be civilized or making progress towards what Americans thought they should be doing, right? And that this would be a way to demonstrate both a united front and a what they would have called a civilized culture that could protect the sovereignty of Choctaws and not allow them to be overrun by Americans who would be able to pull up excuses about them, holding on to the old ways or not making the kind of progress that Americans thought was necessary. So at the beginning of the century, the primordialists were primarily in power. They were the ones who had the positions of influence and power within the divisions. While the cosmopolitans were a younger generation, many of them mixed race, but not all. That doesn't explain all of the positions that people took at this time, because you saw people from both backgrounds on both sides. But many of the cosmopolitans did have that background. And like I said, they were concerned about presenting this united and civilized front to the United States because they believed it was the best way to preserve Choctaw sovereignty. That's what they were being told by their Indian agents, by congressmen, by presidents, that this was the way to preserve their sovereignty. Now, in the beginning of the late 18 teens and beginning of the 1820s, some of the primordialist leaders signaled openness to like a voluntary kind of removal for those who wanted to participate in that. And so they signed the Treaty of Dokestan in 1820, which exchanged some of the Choctaw lands in Mississippi for lands on the other side of the river, right, in what would become Arkansas and the Indian Territory. And this was opposed by the cosmopolitans, such as David Folsom, who publicly, gave them grief and said that this was a sort of selling out. And so afterwards, the treaty ended up, of course, being very unpopular. And it led to David Folsom and some other famous names like Greenwood LaFleur and John Garland being elected as the leaders of those three districts. And so by sweeping into office, these men of the cosmopolitan party or ideology are able to kind of set in action a sort of revolution. They end up being responsible for writing the first written constitution of the Choctaw people in 1826. And here's where we start to see a lot of the changes towards a more American and eventually a particularly Southern kind of government, among other things. So one of the things that Constitution does is it creates a national legislature, a general council that will elect delegates to represent the Choctaw people as a whole. It featured a Declaration of Rights, as was common in Western European and American constitutional government. And it established the beginnings of a judicial system that would expand over time and begin to replace more traditional practices of settling disputes. So for instance, once this new constitutional government took effect, it passed new laws regulating marriage, burial, trials for witchcraft, which has to do with, kind of that whole idea of moving that to the judicial system, and a ban on the whiskey trade as well. The problem for the cosmopolitans, however, is that removal talk in the United States had already reached a critical point within Mississippi, within the national government, especially with the ascent of Andrew Jackson. And so even, this is a question that's greatly speculative, right? Is whether the Choctaws could have actually done anything to prevent removal. It seems unlikely because much of what they were told would save them ended up being ignored, right? Or they were told it was too little too late. But regardless, the cosmopolitan revolution was too late to make this full transformation in Mississippi. But after removal, it would provide a blueprint for change for how the Choctaw Nation could rebuild in the West, restore its prosperity, and continue down this path that many Choctaw leaders still believe, despite the all of the negative experiences of the removal period, they still believed that that path towards what they deemed civilization would be the path to protect their sovereignty in the future. And so what they started in Mississippi provided a kind of blueprint for what they would do in the Indian Territory. And so you see that once the removal occurs, the Choctaws continue to revise and write new constitutions in the Indian Territory. They often follow the language of the United States Constitution and also their neighboring state constitutions of Texas and Arkansas. They were highly influenced by the language of those local state constitutions that they could draw from through the relationships that they had with leaders from those states. So in future constitutions, you see the national legislature is made bicameral, like the United States government and neighboring states. You see the strengthening of protections on individual rights and property, things like freedom of the press, protection against illegal search and seizures, acknowledgement of the private obligation of contracts, things that are very deeply rooted in sort of English common law and in US constitutional law, in the Bill of Rights. Continue to see that development unfold. And like Arkansas and Texas, they also divide the nation into counties as a way of organizing their form of government. And most of this proceeds fairly smoothly through the 1840s and 50s until the late 1850s with the drafting of the Scullyville Constitution of 1857. Because what this constitution did is it abolished the district chiefs and it created a single governor. And so that old split between the primordialists and the cosmopolitans kind of rears its head again, because it's that old debate over what's going to become of us and our autonomy if we get rid of the districts and their chiefs altogether and consolidate under one leader, especially because the last time that fully happened was when Greenwood LaFleur was entrusted with getting a favorable removal treaty, and most Choctaws agreed that he did not, and saw that event as a kind of betrayal. And so they were very skeptical about consolidating the districts into kind of a single nation under a singular governor. And so they got actually very close to, the two parties got very close to going to war with each other. Robert M. Jones, who was a wealthy Choctaw leader, said that his people were in a feverish excitement, ready to burst forth at any moment, killing each other on all occasions. And he cautioned against this division because he believed that that would ultimately be their downfall. The united front was so important for the preservation of Choctaw sovereignty. Another leader who warned against division was Alfred Wade, who was the elected governor under the Scullyville Constitution, who said that the Choctaw people should remember the maxim that in union there is strength, and in all matters affecting the political welfare and their existence as a nation, they should not let anything distract or divide them. They have enough to struggle for as a people without fomenting and encouraging civil strife among themselves. And he encouraged them to come together in brotherly union. And so everyone was able to take a step back, breathe a little bit. And both sides agreed to call a new convention. And they drafted a new constitution of 1860 that was a compromise, which in a sense kind of follows what we saw in the United States, right, with the drafting of the US Constitution as this attempt to compromise to bring groups together. And so what that Constitution did is it restored the district chief, so they would still exist, but it retained a principal chief who would be the overall leader and kind of the figure at the head of the Choctaw Nation. And this Constitution also strengthened the position of slavery in the Choctaw Nation right before the Civil War, right, on the eve of the Civil War, by basically removing the ability of the General Council to regulate or prohibit the introduction of slaves into the Choctaw Nation. And so that's one way in which you see, as these constitutions develop and become more and more like the Texas and Arkansas constitutions, you also see this alignment on the issue of slavery towards a more Southern idea of where that institution should fit into the Choctaw society. Their constitution, the Constitution of 1860, came to bear such a striking resemblance to those of Texas and Arkansas that missionary Cyrus Kingsbury, who was from New England, claimed that they were under the influence of Arkansas lawyers. So you can start to see that although Choctaw government is moving more and more towards looking like this kind of broadly American constitutional government, it's also taking on certain elements that are regionally Southern, right? That connect them specifically in their traditions of government to their Southern neighbors in states like Texas and Arkansas. And so this is just one area in which they get closer and closer in that regard. The important fact is that the Choctaws had found a way to overcome a crisis. They had forged unity as a people and created a new national Choctaw identity like the cosmopolitans had been pushing for over all those years, which they aligned with Southerners, which they saw as being friendly towards and in close relationship with their white Southern neighbors. And the Choctaws would be, along with the Chickasaws, probably the most united of the Southeastern tribes, the relocated tribes, on the eve of the Civil War, who went almost wholly into an alliance with the Confederacy and didn't suffer the same kind of divisions that others did. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit here and look at religion, which is another way in which the Choctaws became more like their American neighbors, but more particularly like their Southern neighbors. Native Choctaw religion had a belief in a great spirit or father, which was fortuitously for the missionaries referred to as Abba. Most of the missionaries who encountered the Choctaws believed that they were monotheistic. Alfred Wright, who was a missionary to the Choctaw Nation, said that they have no idea of a plurality of gods. They invariably assert that they have no traditional knowledge except of one superior being. And the way that they conceive that being is in some ways comparable to deism, in that the Choctaws traditionally believed that the Great Spirit had created the people, given them their civil regulations, and then returned to his place above. He was not necessarily directing every kind of event that occurs on Earth. And they also had a conception of the afterlife where there were good and bad places of rest, but not necessarily tied to an idea like sin that exists within the Christian religion. And so there were similarities that were fortuitous for the missionaries and for the Choctaws who wanted to convert to Christianity. But in the early days, most Choctaws were much more interested in education. And so they brought the missionaries into their territory primarily to educate their children. But of course, there would be interchange of ideas that would lead to conversions and some change over time. And of course, our friend David Folsom was one of the individuals who was at the head of this. He was one of the first to invite missionaries from the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which was a New England-based largely Presbyterian organization to come to Mississippi. So kind of this is before removal here. And as removal got closer and things got more difficult, many Choctaws began to turn to Christianity, which they had initially, like I said, seen mostly as something that was there for education, as something that could actually help them through turbulent times. And in the eyes of their leaders, show the Americans that they could be considered a civilized people, right? And that removal should be averted, right, as a result of that. And again, I like the way that James Carson described this. He talked about a whole nation being made anew in the preaching and solemnizing that went on in the late 1820s. He said that Choctaws began asking for the blessing of God before eating, and excited neophytes looked forward to delivering the good word to their old uncles and aunts. Individual acceptance of the bright path and the communal rituals that celebrated it had combined the salvation vocabulary of Christianity and the religious metaphors and structures of Choctaw cosmology into a powerful new fire. So the idea was that the leaders of the Choctaw Nation were forging something new, a new identity that had Christianity as a part of it. It almost reminded me of sort of the early days of the conversion of the Romans under Constantine, right? It reinvigorates a people with this new idea combined with the old and formed into something uniquely Choctaw, but that also kind of ties them to their neighbors and creates this new thing. The problem, of course, is that the American governments don't really live up to what they had promised the Choctaws about removal. And despite these conversions to Christianity, right, mass conversions up to 1830, it ends up not being enough. And so removal occurs, and it ends up being, of course, a tremendous setback because many people were disillusioned, right? That, we adopted this religion, we made all of these changes, and yet this still occurred. And so some fell away from Christianity, but many were impressed when the missionaries followed them to the West and then began to rebuild the schools, rebuild the churches, rebuild those relationships. And so after a period where there was a sort of lull, conversions began to quicken again in the 1840s. And through this time period, many of the Choctaw leaders converted and started to consider themselves Christians. And then they began to implement this within their laws and practices in government. The Choctaw General Council began to open and close with Christian prayer. The Constitution of 1860 even forbid atheists from holding office. And if you take a look and kind of compare where the Choctaws were in 1860 with where the Confederacy was in the drafting of its new constitution, you see both groups strengthening the position of Christianity within their countries, right? The Confederate Constitution clearly and unambiguously invokes the blessing of Almighty God, right? There's no longer this kind of abstract idea of a creator, as you saw in the Revolutionary era, right? We're moving towards speaking openly about the Christian God. And you see that in both the southern states, which went through many religious revivals through this time, and in the Choctaw Nation. But it wasn't just leaders either. Common Choctaws also converted. Gender roles began to shift in some ways. There's even this little example of how before Christian conversion, I think it said that men would ride the horses and women would walk beside them. And then afterwards, women would ride the horses and men would walk beside them because that was seen as appropriate within Christian morality. Dress also begins to change and conform to kind of Christian ideas of propriety and how men and women should dress. And perhaps most significantly, or one of the most significant signifiers of the changes that Christianity was bringing is that funeral rites and burial practices changed drastically, because before Christianity, the Choctaws had raised their dead on scaffolds. And later on, a group of what they called bone pickers would come and they would clean the remains and place them in a box for the family. And usually the bone pickers came from one of the other divisions. And so this is a way in which the different ethnic groups within the nation also interacted with each other. But the cosmopolitans, of course, were against that. They wanted to have a sort of national Choctaw identity, and Christianity helped in that regard. And so what you see is as Christianity, or as conversions to Christianity intensify, you start to see burials happening. First, kind of around the home, and the former bone pickers would still come and raise these sort of flags to signify the death and the burial. But even that eventually went away, and cemeteries were established, and a very traditional Christian burial process began to become more normative, including for David Folsom, who was buried, as I opened with, in a cemetery with a tombstone, as is typical for Christians. So according to historian Angie Debo and others, the Choctaw Nation could be considered a Christian nation by the time of the opening of the Civil War. And the way that she justified that was she said that about a quarter of the population were members of Presbyterian, Methodist, or Baptist churches, that Sunday observance was general, that there were people going to church everywhere throughout the nation, and that the sessions of the legislature opened and closed with Christian prayer and some of those other signifiers I mentioned about the leaders converting and incorporating that into government. And so by the time of the American Civil War, Christianity is much more influential within Choctaw society than it had been at any time previously. But again, for my argument here, what's really important is that the Choctaws didn't embrace a sort of amorphous kind of American Protestantism. They accepted relationships through kinds of religion that were particularly Southern in orientation. They embraced evangelicalism and the revivals that were occurring throughout the South, just like their neighbors, rather than some of the strains of, say, Unitarianism or the ideologies that were coming out of the burned over district of New York. Right? They were much more in line with the sort of evangelicalism of their Southern neighbors. And also significantly, they ended up breaking with the ABCFM, which was the missionary organization, which was originated in New England, over the teaching of what they called abolition doctrine. Choctaw leaders at this time had, of course, embraced slavery, and they were very defensive about whom they considered to be outsiders, interfering in what they considered to be now at that point a Choctaw institution. And if you listen to what some Choctaw leaders were saying at this time, it sounds really remarkably similar to what Southern political and social leaders were saying. So for instance, George Harkins, who was a prominent Choctaw leader, said in 1855, he said, "I am of the opinion those stinking abolitionists will yet cause the Choctaws a great deal of trouble. The sooner we get rid of them, the better. They are a treacherous, hypocritical set of Yankees." Another prominent Choctaw leader, Israel Folsom, who was a reverend and related to David Folsom, echoed those sentiments. And he said that the abolitionist missionaries were a threat, quote, to the liberty of conscience and freedom of enjoying the rights of property in our own country as a free people. And that, and he also spoke of what he said was, quote, the dangerous tinder of the doctrine of the abolitionists. And so in general, Choctaw leaders were no fans of New England ideologies of abolitionism, and of what they considered to be outside interference. And of course, they had the overwhelming support of newspapers in neighboring Texas and Arkansas, as well as their Southern Indian agents, and also even the help of some Texans on the ground who helped run out some of these missionaries that they thought had overstepped the line. And so after the break occurs with the ABCFM, any missionaries who wanted to stay in the Choctaw Nation and continue to minister to the Choctaw people had to align themselves with the Pro-Southern Assembly of the Presbyterian Church. So a totally different organization that was aligned with Southern ideas and Southern social institutions. And once that occurred, church rolls continued to grow, conversions continued to happen, and Choctaw Confederate soldiers were known for expressing their Christian piety and of coming home, listening to sermons during the war, when they were garrisoned, things like that. Experienced some of the kind of same revivals that Confederate soldiers experienced in other parts of the South throughout the Civil War. And so you can see again in religion, there's this move, this acculturation towards the greater influence of Christianity, but not just this kind of broadly generic American Protestantism or any sort of uniquely New England or Northern kind of Protestantism, but more directly a kind of Southern sense of religion. All right, so economically, you also see a lot of changes occur. You see the transition from that reciprocal subsistence-based economy and the deerskin trade to more intensive agriculture and a market economy. You see the embrace of livestock raising and cotton planting, which became widespread by the 1820s in Mississippi and then followed the Choctaws to the Indian Territory. And you even see the rooting of or implantation of cowboy culture within the Choctaw Nation, brought by Southerners from places like Georgia and Carolina. The implantation of what was called cracker culture from kind of the poor whites and from those areas of the country came and imparted this idea of cowboy culture and livestock knowledge to the Choctaws. The Choctaws also began to grow cotton. They got their first cotton seeds from their Indian agent at the time, who was Samuel Mitchell of Tennessee, another Southerner, and took to cotton because for various reasons, it really fit into the Choctaw economy and what they were trying to do. One of those things was it gave them a prosperous cloth industry pioneered by Choctaw women who used the cotton to create clothing, which was very valuable. But it also fit into some of the elements of gender roles that persisted in the Choctaw Nation, one of which was that men were typically not considered to be, it wasn't considered appropriate for men to work the fields. And so that's where African slavery slotted in very naturally for the Choctaws as a way for Choctaw men to raise crops and to benefit from raising crops without having to necessarily violate those gender roles that were a part of their culture. Although I'm sure on a lower level of, those who are still in subsistence agriculture, that might not have been, that might have been a luxury. So this transition, this economy, like I said, follows the Choctaws to the Indian Territory. It's very fitting for the Red River Valley in which the Choctaw Nation grew. And so livestock took off, cotton planting took off. And by the 1850s, the Choctaws had a very prosperous economy that looked very much again like the economies of their neighbors in Arkansas and in Texas, both at the level of plantation agriculture, but also the subsistence farming that occurred all around. And their homes, farms, etc., came to look very much like those of the Texans and the Arkansan neighbors that they had such close contact with.
Josh, I just want to say we have about 6 minutes remaining, so I'm not sure if you want to have Q&A, but just to let you know.
Okay. I think I only have about 3 slides left, so I'll try to move through them fairly quickly so we can have at least a few minutes.
Okay, thanks.
So you see also, aside from just changes in the economy to look like a Southern economy, you see connections established through the economy and through social organizations. River trade brought the Choctaws into close social contact with their neighbors in Arkansas and Texas. Those American officials who oversaw them were often Southerners, including the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Elias Rector, who was from Arkansas. He was brothers with the governor of Arkansas, which meant that the Choctaws could, reach out to him for help. And also their Indian agent through most of the post-removal period was Douglas Cooper, who was a Mississippian. So when the Choctaws needed help with something, they usually went to Southerners. When it came to getting their money from the removal treaty that had been backed up, they reached out to Arkansas Senator Robert Johnson, and he recommended a lawyer, Albert Pike, who helped them on the net proceeds case and eventually became the man who negotiated the Confederate treaty with them. So close relationships, especially in Arkansas. Pike is also important because he led the Masonic lodges in Arkansas, which had jurisdiction over the Masonic lodges in Indian Territory. So you see Choctaws and Southerners coming together in social institutions like Masonic lodges. Robert M. Jones, for instance, was a very high-level Mason, and he's the one who worked with Pike on the Confederate Treaty. Another group was the Knights of the Golden Circle, which was a pro-Southern secession organization that was very strong in Texas, but it also had a lodge in the Indian Territory and had Choctaw members who would learn all about pro-secession ideology. And on a more practical level, Choctaws also worked side by side with Texans in patrols to defend their people collectively against Comanche raiders. And so what you see through the 1850s especially is the development of a Southern identity and a vibrant pro-Southern culture that's growing through closer intermarriage and social interaction and economic interaction between Choctaws and their white Southern neighbors. So quickly, here are just some opinions, both from the Choctaws and from Southerners about the Choctaw people. Their Indian agent, Douglas Cooper, said that the Choctaws belong among the free and sovereign states of the Union and should soon be entitled to citizenship. So a very high opinion of them. Elias Rector, Indian Affairs, said that if any Indian tribe can ever be incorporated into this union, it will be the Choctaws. So again, held in very high regard. And Albert Pike said that the Choctaws were in a rapid state of improvement, entirely Southern, and determined to adhere to the fortunes of the South. And so you can see that there's a lot of love coming from Southern leaders towards the Choctaw Nation, and this is reciprocated by the Choctaws themselves, who passed a resolution in their General Council in February of 1861 when the secession crisis was going on, saying that in the event of a permanent dissolution of the American Union, their many relations with the general government must cease, and they shall be left to follow the interests of their people, which indissolubly bind us in every way to the destiny of our neighbors and brethren of the Southern states, upon whom we are confident we can rely for the preservation of our rights of life, liberty, and property, and the continuance of many acts of friendship, general counsel, and material support. So the very last thing here is just to look at a couple of aspects of the Confederate Treaty to show how this relationship between Southerners and Choctaws was fruitful, and to show why the Choctaws entered into an alliance with the Confederacy. They were given some of the finest terms that I think the Choctaws ever received in a treaty with a European or American government. They received the unrestricted right to self-government, which gave them complete control over internal affairs as long as their laws were consistent with the CSA Constitution, and they allowed the Confederate government to regulate trade. The treaty also protected Choctaw civil rights and made them competent witnesses in court cases, allowed them to sue in any court without discrimination, allowed them to transport stock freely throughout the Confederacy, and even allowed them to settle and hold property equally with any white citizen of any Confederate state. Most significantly, probably, they were given for the first time a Choctaw delegate to the Confederate Congress, which was the first time that any Indian or perhaps even any non-white person was able to participate in an American national legislature. The Confederacy granted that to them. And it also significantly gave them a pathway to Choctaw statehood as an equal state in the Confederacy. And this is something that the Confederates only offered to the Choctaws and Chickasaws. The state would be theirs, and any other group would have to come in with their permission. And this, of course, would probably be a better prospect than incorporation into a Northern Union because of the Confederate emphasis on state sovereignty affirmed in the Confederate Constitution that would give the Choctaws tremendous control over the policies and the laws of their state and could potentially prohibit widespread immigration and things that they saw as a threat to their sovereignty. So I think what Robert Jones was doing in negotiating this treaty with Albert Pike and the Confederacy was bringing the work of David Folsom to fruition, bringing the Cosmopolitan Revolution to a successful conclusion, and providing what I think was the best chance for the Choctaws since European contact to finally and completely preserve their sovereignty and culture as Choctaws and as Southern people. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Josh Phillips, for this presentation and all your research. Do you mind stopping the share so we can see you?
Okay.
We are fortunate that normally we are very tight back to back, and we are now at the 50-minute mark. So I understand if people have to leave, but I do want to encourage people that you can use the chat to maybe post some questions for Josh. I don't know, Josh, could people reach out to you? Maybe you could put your email in the chat so people can send you feedback. We also will put a link to a survey after each session. We ask everyone to please click on the link to a survey where you can also provide feedback. We value this feedback. We need it for always strengthening our symposium, and it's a part of also often stipulations for sponsorship and different dynamics. So thank you for taking the time to look for that survey, which should be popping up in the chat soon. Or someone asked about recordings of the sessions. That is a wonderful resource. We're thankful for our presenters and participants for their consent of the recordings. The Center for Tribal Studies that primarily hosts and directs the symposium, they'll be in touch about the recordings or how to access them. So follow and check out the official website of the symposium where you came to access the different hyperlinks for the meetings. That will be an important place. We have other questions, popping up in the chat. So unfortunately, we won't have much time to address all of them, but something that I wanted to point out after this presentation, I'm fortunate that I'm teaching a class on history of Native Americans in Oklahoma, and several of my students are Choctaw or they are focusing on Choctaw history. So I did notice maybe some names of students of mine. So I appreciate that they were able to join this session that's especially relevant, important to the class that we're talking about. But some questions that I hope you address more in the future or consider, Josh, with your research is I am especially interested in knowing more about your methodology and sources. It is so fascinating how when folks talk about the 5 tribes, the quote, 5 civilized tribes, even these terms that we use of like the cosmopolitan and pre-mortalism, those kind of terms that you were referring to from, was it Carson's work?
Yes.
I'm interested in what kind of, new terms or pushing the terms you can find in your research, because a lot of this is about language, right? Of drawing those connections between language in the laws, in the government, the governance, as you said, the Constitution, how that relates of being identified or identifying with Southerner, and then, of course, slavery and how we talk about that history of slavery, enslaved, freed people, which we didn't even approach in this conversation today. And then religion as well, right? So there's a lot of different terms that come in, and they're heavily, Euro-American centric. And I wonder about Choctaw language, even when you refer to the quote bone pickers, right, with the ancestral practices and changes in burial rites and such. What do Choctaw people say in their language? And it often reminds me how I feel in history, especially studies of Native American history, how essential it is. And I hope to encourage all historians who work with Native Americans and Indigenous studies to explore and understand the sources in Choctaw language. And it's been impressive how Choctaw Nation, I see it in my students, there's the effort of language revitalization and vitality. And I think that will be important, with understanding as well the Choctaw lived and historical experience. And it'll be fascinating to learn more about individuals like David Folsom, who are, every person is so complicated and how they interweave in these broad dynamics. And another fascinating point of your research was pointing out how Choctaw have this unity, this unified stance in these different regards, but yet, civil war and the issues over identity and certainly regarding slavery are very divisive and very controversial. And some folks brought up wondering, the implications of these studies in the present day and some of the debates and controversies surrounding, identity of Black freed people and incredible works that we're seeing of Dr. Elena Roberts, for example, bringing in family history and genealogies as well in her studies of Chickasaw Nation. So it'll be very interesting to see your work as it progresses, and I look forward to how that comes. And then others, I have one of my students made a point here. She's a citizen of Choctaw Nation. She said, as a citizen, a tribal member of Choctaw Nation, I believe that you brought forth the identity of the Choctaw Nation very well. And I thank you for being informational about the nation. So we do certainly appreciate your work, and thank you for sharing it today with us at the symposium. So unfortunately, we're up on time now, but thank you so much, Josh. And I hope to stay in touch. Josh shared his email, and folks, the link is there to the survey. That's also shared. The survey results are shared with the presenters, and that's been helpful to me when I've presented to hear from you all. That's a chance as well to give us feedback. So thank you again, everyone. And Josh, I hope to stay in touch and that one day you all can join us here in Tahlequah, hopefully in the near future. Yeah. Thank you. Stay safe and well, everyone.
Thanks, you too.